but I eventually realized that it's a game about like dealing with people in violent gangs and fighting against like fascist soldiers and stuff. So I knew that I needed a health stat.
This is James Patton, and this is his latest game, Duskpunk, a dice driven narrative RPG about survival, freedom, agency, and fighting back against an oppressive capital owning class. And this is Jump Over the Ages Citizen Sleeper, a critically acclaimed dice driven narrative RPG about survival, freedom, agency, and fighting back against an oppressive capital owning class. Now, if you're the observant type, you might have noticed some similarities both in the looks of these games and the descriptions I just gave, and that's not by accident. See, Duskpunk might be what some would consider the first Citizen Sleeper like. A little emphasis on might be. The wonderful and horrifying thing about games today is that there are so many coming out all the time from across the world, across multiple storefronts and hidden forums, that to call anything the first of literally anything risk being a little ambitious. However, when the literal creator of Citizen Sleeper, Gareth Martin, says it might be the first Citizen Sleeper, like, well, I pay attention and end up playing the game to completion. Now, for me, there's a more interesting and maybe more important question than whether or not Duskpunk is the first Citizen Sleeper like. And that's, what does that even mean? Is it a pure rip of the mechanics from the space epic that sees you running from a corporation looking to collect on its sentient property? Does it have something to do with the themes of survival and freedom like I hinted at earlier? Where does like as a descriptor start and stop for what might be the first Citizen Sleeper like? Well, the interview that you're about to watch aims to start a conversation about those very questions. Over the course of this chat, you'll see James Patton and I not just talk about Citizen Sleeper and how it inspired Duskpunk, but also James' journey as a game developer, what immersion in video games looks like, and what kind of expectations X-like as a descriptor sets for prospective players. And lastly, if you enjoy even a little bit of this interview, please consider liking and subscribing for more games coverage like this. And while you're at it, leave a comment below if you have any thoughts about Duskpunk, Citizen Sleeper, or if there are any other game developers you want me to interview. Can't promise that it'll happen, but never hurts to ask. And if you're itching for more interviews like this, consider checking out my website Exalclaw, where I have a couple more that I've done over the past year, in addition to a few features and occasional news piece. Alright, that's enough setup. Enjoy the interview. Thanks again for sitting down and talking to me about your game Duskpunk, James. I really appreciate the time that you made for this today.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just like to start off, I would love for you to introduce yourself to people first, specifically talking about how long you've been into game development, what kind of games you've been into, and how you ended up coming to Duskpunk now.
Hi everyone, I'm James Patton. I'm an independent game developer. I'm pretty much a solo dev, but I use freelancers for a few things here and there. And my studio is called Clockwork Bird, but it's mostly just me. So, I got into game development when I don't know. I think the first games I made were when I was like in primary school,
Oh,
so like
really?
kindergarten basically. Not like they weren't full games. They were like me sketching out where like this is where you put your pieces, and so they were kind of, me sort of drawing the idea of a game rather than actually making a game. But yeah, I started programming because I wanted to learn how to make them when I was about 10, 11 or something, and I've just kind of kept going on that because I always knew that I wanted to make them. And I was always very drawn to narrative games. So my earliest gaming memories are playing adventure games like the King's Quest series,
Mm.
which is a Sierra point and click series. Um, it's the kind of series where I'm not sure I can fully recommend it these days because it's so punishing, but it really kind of captured my imagination at the time. And then, yeah, I was sort of working on various hobby projects, and I eventually got one project that I thought kind of could maybe be the one that kind of allows me to sort of raise my level a bit in terms of providing a financial kind of foundation for myself. And so I put that on Kickstarter, and this was back when you could do that with a sort of an unfinished prototype, and people would kind of engage with it in sort of good faith.
Right.
I think Kickstarter has become a bit more of a sort of pre-order store these days. But that was just enough for me to kind of make enough money to work on it for 6 months, and I got a grant and I released it. And that game was called Spinortality, and it was a cyberpunk management sim where you run a giant evil company in the future, with the goal of eventually becoming immortal through cloning and other like capitalist nonsense, and eventually sort of dominating the globe through your company. And so that went quite well. And then I worked on a few other games. The other narrative ones that are sort of note, I guess, are I made a game called Silicon Dreams, which is about you're an android in a cyberpunk setting, and you're interrogating other androids because they are broken.
Hmm.
But when I say broken, what I really mean is that they're not behaving according to the way that the manufacturer says that they ought to be behaving. So these androids, some of them are broken and they killed somebody, and that's not great. But some of them have like discovered that they hate their owners, or that they have fallen in love with somebody, and that's considered going against the warranty or whatever.
Right.
So that's a game about agency and power and what you can do inside of a kind of a hegemonic structure almost. And then I made another game for a studio called Causa Creations, which was a tabletop game. So kind of like D&D, but it uses a kind of Renaissance fantasy setting, and the kind of key twist is that instead of dice, it uses tarot cards, and it uses tarot cards for everything from skill checks, which are sort of numerical based, all the way up to like you can generate entire scenarios, entire adventures with the cards because they're kind of a creative prompt as well. Yeah, and at that point in my, well, I call it a career. It's me kind of failing forwards and stumbling around and
Yeah.
trying to sort of figure out how to make it all work.
Right. Developing your
Yeah, you
practice.
talk to devs, you know how it is.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good way of, yeah. I like that phrase. It makes it sound intentional. I so at that point I was kind of at a stage where I actually was working with a friend of mine. His name was Daniel Adams, and so we made Silicon Dreams and the Hidden Isle, which is the tarot RPG together.
Mhm.
And it got eventually to the point where we were like, we realized that our hope that we could kind of keep a two-person studio running based on narrative expertise didn't really pan out in terms of there was some demand for writers and narrative designers and stuff, but there wasn't really enough to sustain us as a two-person studio.
Mm.
So we ended up splitting, and he found work somewhere else. I kept going as one person. We're still friends, and he's doing very well.
Nice.
But I was at the point where I looked at my bank account and my spreadsheets and stuff, and I realized, well, I have a tiny art budget, and I have maybe 8 months of runway left. What the hell can I do with that? But I had just recently played Citizen Sleeper, which is a wonderful narrative game. And I played it, and I was like, wow, the way that this game uses text and dice and characters and all this stuff to make me feel like I'm part of this world, it was astonishing to me. And I saw kind of bits of tabletop games. I saw bits of like Fallen London, if you know that one. It's a browser based game, but it's about
I've
existing
heard of
in
it, but
this
I haven't
sort of
played it
weird
before.
city.
No.
Mm. So it's kind of it was the first game, because it launched in like, I don't know, 2010 or maybe even earlier, but it was the first game that I played where it said, this is a role playing game, and you have multiple stats, and all of the skill checks are resolved by checking those stats. So it's totally standard up until here, but only one of those stats is combat. And the others are for others, so for different things. So like the mechanical way that you resolve a skirmish in on the rooftops of the city, or like a gang war or something. That's the same way that you resolve your ability to write an opera, for
Oh,
example. And I was like,
okay.
at that point,
Mind
yeah.
blown by just a simple
Um,
change.
exactly. And I think if I played like any D&D at that point, it wouldn't have been so mind blowing. But I still think that in the digital realm, it was still quite groundbreaking, because you do have some skill checks in computer role playing games
Hmm.
that are not combat, but the genre on like in the digital realm is still, I think, fairly dominated by combat, because combat is something that you can kind of easily it's a quick way to get like conflict and stakes and stuff. And it's most importantly, it is easily reproducible with a computer.
Hmm.
Whereas there's other challenges you might face in a tabletop version of D&D or any tabletop game. Like you need to bluff your way past the guard, or you need to convince the handmaiden that you actually care about the princess, or like all of those more the kind of checks that are a bit more nuanced. Those are perfectly easy to do at a table because your game master can improvise.
Hmm.
But you tended not to see those in digital games. And so Fallen London kind of did that for me first. And then it's kind of similar for Citizen Sleeper because there's more skills. I think still only one of them is combat. And it's focused. It's like you're a person in this universe who is just trying to live and survive. And that's the same kind of setup that Fallen London has. Like you just sort of awaken in the city almost. I think you break out of prison actually, but you kind of, narratively speaking, you're a nobody. You come from nowhere, and you had to figure out uh, like what are the rules of this city? What does this place mean as a setting? What are the different factions? What actions can I take to kind of pursue my goals? Um, and I think Citizen Sleeper took that to a whole new level with those mechanics. So I played Citizen Sleeper, and I thought, well, I need to make something. I don't have a
Hmm.
lot of money to do it with. I'm pretty good at writing text, and I can write text fast if I have to. And I thought, well, Citizen Sleeper seems like a pretty interesting template to be working with because I think it's really cutting edge, really interesting. And it seems like, so the game is very polished, but in terms of the amount of work that you would have to put in to reproduce something like that, it doesn't have that many assets, that there isn't that much content apart from the writing. So I
Right.
thought that was sort of a pretty good thing to aim for. And it turns out that I had more runway than 8 months because I got a grant from the city of Vienna, from the business agency, actually,
Right.
because they're trying to simulate businesses here. And so that meant that I could work on it for 2 years rather than like half a year.
Nice.
Um,
And so
but yeah, that's
just
kind of how I got there.
nice. Okay. I'm glad you brought in the citizen sleeper part and talking about it because that was going to be one of the first things I was asking you about was what was your impressions when you first played Citizen Sleeper that made you think to yourself, this
Mm.
fit? This is a game template that I want to use for something in the future, or was there some version of Duskpunk that was already existing in your mind ahead of time that you once you started playing Citizen Sleeper, you're like, oh, this is the best way to help me realize the vision for this game?
That's a really good question. So, if anyone hasn't played it, Citizen Sleeper is well, Gareth, the developer, calls it a dice-driven RPG, which I think is a pretty good description. So it's a game where the main mechanic is your ability to manage dice and resources. And it's just about you as one character surviving and prospering in this world and meeting other people and making connections and stuff. So it's set on a space station, which is kind of run down and is a bit of a lawless kind of setting. And the to kind of walk you through a day in the life of this character, the first thing you do in Citizen Sleeper is you roll a bunch of dice, a bunch of six-sided dice, and those are then the dice that you can spend that day, and then you can go anywhere in the sort of that quarter of the city, and you can spend those dice on whatever action you want. And so some of those actions are kind of basic, like you can haul crates out the docks and you can make money from that. And if you use a higher valued die for that, then you'll do better and you'll make more money. And maybe if you use a low value die, then you won't get any money, or maybe you'll succeed, but something bad will happen. Um, and one of the things that I found interesting is the game kind of uses this system borrowed from tabletop, which is that every action can either be fully like outrageously successful, it can fail, which doesn't mean that something bad happens necessarily, or it can be kind of middling successful. So that either
Hmm.
means that you kind of do it but not quite, or you do it but there's a consequence, right? And what I liked about that was that if you um, it sort of keeps things a bit more interesting than that binary sort of succeed fail system. And the fact that some of the actions can have a negative consequence is a really easy way of adding stakes that doesn't feel cheap. It just feels like it's part of the kind of narrative. Um, and the thing that really kind of drives it forward as a system is that when you've used up all your dice, that's the end of the day, because those were the dice you roll for that day. So you go to sleep, and you roll a bunch more dice for the next day. But when you sleep, you lose. Oh, I forget the names of the variables, but you lose basically energy,
Yeah,
I
you
think.
lose it's called
Um,
condition. You lose condition and also energy
yeah, I think
over time
I
too.
think you lose energy, and then you lose condition if you lose too much
Yes,
energy.
that is exactly right. And sometimes there's
Yeah.
situations in Citizen Sleep where you can lose
Yep.
just condition as well, but you're absolutely right. Most of the time, most people
Hmm.
that I think play that will have a
Yeah.
situation where they run out of energy, have to use energy again for something else, and then condition starts being
Hmm.
taken away instead of the energy.
Yep. And the nice thing is that like not only does energy drop every day, because that's kind of like you getting hungry, but also condition drops by one every day as well. So there's this very slow ticking clock that's driving you towards, okay, if your condition fully runs out, that's very bad. And the other nice thing is that as condition falls, if it falls a little bit, then you roll one fewer die, and if it falls a bit more than that, then you roll two fewer die, and so on. So that means that there's this interesting kind of push pull, almost like a push your luck system, where you're like, I could improve my energy again. I could restore it back to its full value with a drug that you take. Um, But is it worth doing it today, or should I wait until tomorrow? Because if I wait until tomorrow, then my condition will be, I kind of gained a day almost. But if I wait too long, then I'm going to have a bunch of days where I'm just rolling one or two dice, and that seems kind of inefficient. So there's this really interesting kind of, I like the fact that it gives you a short term goal, which is your energy always has to be full or like near full, because if it drops too much, you lose condition. And then, if your energy is okay, then you can start exploring the city and meeting the factions and stuff. And every time you meet a faction member, you have a little conversation with them in a sort of visual novel interface, which I borrowed for Duskpunk as well. Which these are really nicely written scenes where you really feel the humanity of those characters, and that felt like a very natural way to bring that in. Um, and then your long-term goal is to keep your condition up. And then your very long-term goal is to escape from the enemies that are hounding you. So in the story is that you're a kind of an android with, well, it's a bit complicated, but you're effectively an android on the run from a company because the company owns you, and the game is about you trying to free yourself from the control of this company so you can kind of live your own life. So that's your kind of very very long term system. And I just love the way that like it in the way that the best board games and tabletop games do it. It just used a few numbers and a few rules to create a really compelling engine that keeps driving you forward. But it's an engine where, like, yes, it's mechanical, and yes, it's kind of numerical and value based or whatever. But it fully supports these conversations with these characters, and every action you take feels like it's part of this world because of the way that it's presented. So even though it's mechanical, every time you engage with that mechanical system, it still feels narrative. And so I thought that was such a cool kind of combination. Yeah.
No, it's an incredibly cool combination. And then this brings me a nice segue to talk about your game a bit more with Dustpunk, because I feel like even before we even get to mechanics, there's a few narrative similarities and themes that I think are worth talking about. As you just mentioned with Citizen Sleeper, a very long term goal of the game, outside of just taking care of yourself, is to eventually free yourself from the people that, for people that don't know about the game, effectively own your body. It is very quite literally like not even invisible chains. They have direct access to your body, a way of tracking you, and that basically becomes the whole crux of the game. How do I free myself from this invisible hand that is about to become very visible in certain parts of the game when the people start tracking you down as well? Dustpunk, you start the player kind of similar to what we were talking about in a new city, kind of from a very rude awakening after almost dying, basically a nobody, and also still having some sense of agency lost, but rather did in the explicit way of an android or a cyborg, but in this case, a soldier. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that choice of still having an agency forward story, but choosing war as the way to examine it.
So the original pitch for Duskpunk was I was playing a lot of Blades in the Dark, which is a tabletop game in a kind of dark steampunk-ish universe.
Okay.
And I was thinking about Fallen London, and I had played Citizen Sleeper, and I was like, okay, I think I can sort of combine these somehow. What if the goal is? Oh, and I really liked. I was trying to think, what kind of world do I want to create for this kind of a game? And I always really loved the world of Dishonored, which is a series of like immersive stealth sims,
Yeah.
also set in a kind of in a steampunk world. Um, Especially the Dishonored concept art, which is just absolutely like the game itself is wonderful, but the concept art is like on a
Yeah, I'll see if I
whole
can
other
pull up
level.
some
It's
pictures of it
grungy.
when I show this on the YouTube too,
Yeah,
because it really is some phenomenal art. The team behind that, that's from Arcane Studios, right?
from
That's
Arcane,
on it.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, they have some great artists over there.
Yeah, and I love the way that like just the even like the form of the art because it is digital I think, but it's done in this wonderful grungy oil painting style, and I love the way that the concept art itself kind of felt like it had come from the world in some weird way, which is why they were able to use some of it in the like the portraits in the game. So I'd always loved that world, and I thought that was incredibly cool. So I thought, okay, let's do steampunk. Let's make it radical because, and thinking about suffering and the class warfare because I don't like the way that some steampunk, I think most actually, ends up focusing on the kind of the princesses who are able to build robots or whatever, or the sort of middle class
Mm,
dilettantes who've got the top hats and the it just feels a bit strange that when your kind of main inspiration is the 19th century, you don't talk about the oppression of working people in that time period because it was really extreme.
right.
So I knew that was always going to be in there. But the original pitch was that it would just be like this crazy, dishonored, steampunky world with these die rolls and these actions. But the goal would just be sort of similar to Fallen London. You would just make it big in the big city. And Danny was still working with me at this point. We were sort of doing a few weeks of Dustpunk work to kind of take us out. And he said, I don't think that's a bit boring. Why don't you make it like about an actual revolution? Like, why can't that be where the plot goes? Because you're already talking about all these other things that are sort of related to class warfare and these other kind of topics. And I'd already come up with the idea at that point that because I wanted it to focus on this class divide, that one of the key narrative things would be plasm, which is this sort of super fuel, which can be extracted from the bones of the dead. Which means that, of course, the if you are a working class family and your grandmother dies, her corpse is now the property of the state because the war effort or whatever. But of course the nobles they get to put all of their dead in the high fancy crypts because the nobility need to mourn and apparently it's a symbol for the country or whatever. Yeah, so I think war was this really interesting kind of focal point because I was already doing some reading on class struggle generally, but it seemed like it really the class struggle of Europe hit a really interesting point during World War One, where at the start of the war, everyone was kind of they fell for the lies of their own sort of imperialist ruling class, who said, "Yes, you're fighting for Germany or you're fighting for Britain to
Hmm.
defend against the English hordes or the Germanic hordes." Which doesn't really make sense because if the English are fighting to defend England and if the Germans are fighting to defend Germany, then why is anyone fighting?
Right. Who's attacking
And
who?
then, well, exactly, yeah. And then by the end of the war, they'd seen through it all. Like it turns out that the war was not even ended by one side like actually giving up necessarily. The Germans lost because there was a little German revolution led by working class Germans and German soldiers. And that was the thing that finally made it impossible for the Germans to continue fighting. So I always thought that this was a really interesting sort of point in history, and also World War One was this really interesting, um, like that there are so many aspects of it that tell you so much about the sort of the class warfare and the almost sort of steampunkish elements, like the Freikorps, who were they were the sort of the mercenaries who came back from the German front and became the proto-fascists. They were disillusioned because of their experience in World War One.
Mm.
And I have a character that's kind of a proto Freikorps, basically. And sort of beyond that, it also meant that I could bring in these other factions like the factory workers and the machinists are kind of a little bit like anarchists, but they're also a bit sort of different. But it sort of was a really good opportunity for me to sort of pull all of these ideas together into one kind of high stakes situation. And I think the experience of being a soldier was a very leveling one, and it meant that I could kind of have the main character be a sort of every man's well every man every woman. You can be male, female, non-binary, whatever. But it meant that you could sort of play this sort of common protagonist that could sort of stand for almost anyone, because the soldiers of World War One in our history and in this fictional world as well were just conscripts drawn from every walk of life. Yeah, so it seemed like a really interesting um, kind of way to raise the stakes and pull these narrative threads all into one place, I think.
It's good to hear. And it was interesting. It feels like it came through with the game too, because there was a gradual build
Mm.
of what it feels like. At the very start of the game, you already have it laid out of what are some long-term goals you can think around this character. But then the way that you weave the story together over time, regardless of which faction it is, I think you did a really good job of capturing the way war touches a little bit of everything, no matter who you are. And so there is by the time you roll credit on Duskpunk, I feel like there's a pretty clear understanding about why everyone takes what side they are on in that war, and why, to be honest, a good amount of people in the factions are on your side or working against the ruling class at that point. So it makes sense where those inspirations came from. I feel like they came through well. But speaking of inspirations, I'd love to start talking about the mechanics of Dustpunk a bit more, because one of the things that was
Mm.
fascinating me about playing it when I first saw it advertised, when you were talking about it on Blue Sky specifically as a sleeper, like, is where there were similarities between the two games and where they started to diverge. So there's a few things that were the same. That stress system, for example, in Dustpunk felt really reminiscent of stuff that was going on with Citizen Sleeper, of this, oh, here's this constant thing that you have to be aware of, making sure that the currency that you accumulate in the game actually does help reduce that stress. And Citizen Sleeper was like fending off the condition going all the way down. What I'm actually curious about, though, some of the ways in which Dustpunk has like very clear differences from Citizen Sleeper. One of my more favorite ones is in Dustpunk, you have those Blue Lantern areas, for example, where you can kind of get a bit of a glimpse into the world of the game. Could you talk a little bit more about those and where that came from? Because it was interesting for me in that they didn't have a very, in a weird way, they weren't incredibly useful for the game, but they did a great job of fleshing out the world. So I was wondering where that idea came from.
Yeah, they're like functionally useless but really nice, right?
Yeah.
So so the just to sort of paint a picture of how it works, the game is played on a map of the city, and you can click any location on the the main locations on the map to zoom in and do an action there. And then there's also events that happen, which are these big yellow lanterns. You click one of them, and you have some kind of interaction with like a major character that pushes forward either a side quest or the main quest. But yeah, there is these little blue lanterns, which are, I call them curiosities, because it's like the thing that I really liked about Dishonored was the fact that it had such a fleshed out world that it felt really real. It felt like it had centuries of history to it. And I wasn't really sure. I thought that like you could probably kind of try to get that in just through the visual novel segments, but it would be kind of shoehorned, and it would take up a lot of time, and it would be sort of annoying. But then I was sort of reminded of like I actually live in Vienna in Austria. I moved here about 12 years ago, and I think it's quite interesting just the number of times that I've been sort of walking around the city and I've just found something like a statue or a weird staircase or a painting on the side of a building. And I'm like, huh, that's cool. And I think it's really interesting how like the built environment of the city kind of has this history embedded in it, and that there are stories that you can kind of untangle if you can sort of just find the right, if you can talk to the right person or sort of untangle the right thread or whatever. So I just thought, well, I'll just put that in the game. So you'll be walking along and you'll find a statue or a weird hill or whatever. And I thought I would go a bit. Um, Originally, I thought it would just be like, oh, here's a statue of a character from 100 years ago who did such and such, and there's a few of those, but it's just more fun when they're a bit more strange and unusual. So I ended up kind of gravitating towards more of those being these strange expressions of like working class culture or the myths that the ruling class tell us or weird folk traditions that seem a little strange or something, or like places that have been abandoned but sort of reclaimed, like squats or something. Just because I thought those are the kind of, I think it's in those unusual areas that are surprising that you learn more about the city. If I was like, oh, here's a statue of a saint, then it's like, okay, cool, whatever. But we know what those are, so they're not really interesting.
Yeah, I would agree that they really do an interesting job of like making this place feel like it has a culture. I think one of my favorite instances of the blue one was when you can walk in the first area that the game has unlocked. They have this metalwork person who's just making characters basically of people, almost in the way that you would imagine going through something like New York City and seeing one of those character artists stop people on the street and draw them, except with like metal instead. I was like, oh, this is such an
Hmm.
interesting way to still kind of touch on something that so many people have a touchstone to, but do it in a way that really fits the world of Duskpunk. So those curiosities, I think, ended up being one of my favorite parts of the game, even though, like you said, they are functionally useless, which I thought was really funny. And just as a quick sidebar, I'm curious, the way you were talking about just the way games can have such a history with Dishonored and now with Duskpunk, are there any other games or just whether it be tabletop or digital that you feel do a really good job of fleshing out their world and the way in which it makes you explore the world?
Ooh. I mean, I still think the Citizen Sleeper is kind of really the standout here. I think I've been playing a lot of Blueprints, or I
Mm,
played a lot last year, and I think Blueprints, it doesn't, the world building is not actually that good. It's a little ropey in certain areas, but I have to give it a lot of credit because Blueprints is basically a puzzle game. But you really have to learn the lore of the world in order to solve the puzzles.
mm,
There are some puzzles that are based on the geography of the world or even some of its languages. Every nation has a different color and different symbols associated with it and stuff. So even though like the world building is actually quite basic, I think that the way that you interact with the world building and that you have to learn the world building is kind of astonishing in terms of the way that you kind of you had to internalize it really. And another game that I think that has a really interesting like relation to world building is a game from Inkle, also a narrative game called Heaven's Vault.
okay.
So that's a game. You if you're interested in narrative games, I really do recommend it. It's a game set in a kind of sci-fi-ish world, but it's almost like there's a lot of sort of high technology, but it feels kind of like late feudal in a sense. It's actually very inspired by the kind of Islamic golden age. There's a lot of sort of Islamic stylings and stuff,
Okay.
which is really nice to see just generally because you don't see enough Islam in sci-fi
No,
nowadays.
there's really not. Actually, that's a really good point. There
Yeah,
really is not a lot of Islamic representation in
right.
sci-fi stuff.
Like, why not?
I've never actually thought about that until you just said that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I know there's
yeah.
not huge representation in
But
games in general because just the representation of Islam in games is something that's
mm,
like a whole different subject in and of itself. But in sci-fi specifically,
well,
you're
yeah,
right. Yeah.
yeah, and I think in the world, even like sci-fi novels, there's a little bit, but it's quite rare. So anyway, that's a it's nice just for that aspect, to be honest. But the kind of hook of Heaven's Vault is that you are an archaeologist. Everyone else believes that time goes in a circle. So we have literally been here before. Our actions today will cause tomorrow, and eventually someone will be born who is you from when you were born, and it's all just the same thing over and over. So it's interesting being an archaeologist where you're like, no, it's linear, guys. It's just a line. Um, but and the hook is that you dig up stuff like artifacts, and they have inscriptions on them in an alien language. Well, it from your point of view, a historic language, and you have to decipher these glyphs. And sometimes the glyphs even like it's a language where the glyphs build up to you take two glyphs together, they form a word, and then you can add more to make more complex words. And some of the glyphs actually are inspired by real world things. Like there's a moment where you realize that the flag of this nation is a more kind of neatened version of a glyph that you found that means something totally different because the nation has forgotten what it originally meant. So that's just
Oh,
a really
okay.
cool
That is super cool.
way of like binding the world building and the main mechanic and the language and stuff. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
Nice, cool. Oh, thank you for the suggestion. You said it was called Heaven's Vault, right? From Inkle?
Heaven's Vault from Inkle. Yeah.
Okay, definitely have to check that out. And just to bring it back a little bit to Duskpunk and even inspirations at large, something that I wanted to ask you about was two things. First, what was the decision process like for you marketing this game as a sleeper? Like, I'm understanding why it was an inspiration for you and just from like the quality of the game, but having an inspiration and then naming a game as an inspiration in your marketing, two different things. So I was curious about that. And
Mhm.
then B, what was the process like in trying to figure out what worked from Citizen Sleeper for Duskpunk versus what didn't? How did you
Mm.
know what to pull from your inspiration that didn't hurt and would end up helping the vision you had for Duskpunk as a
Mhm.
whole?
Yeah, so the marketing thing, so I think the main reason, so the main reason I picked Citizen Sleeper was it seemed like a good way to take my skills and turn them into a thing that was finished and saleable. But
Mm.
the more I thought about it, the more I was like, no, this makes total sense because Citizen Sleeper has made a bajillion dollars, right? It's on Game Pass. I think it's crossed a million players or something. It must at least have made I think at least $300,000 or something. So
Mm.
I thought, my goal was like, if I can hit, 40K, then I'm good. And that's over the course of multiple years. So I thought if I can just like have a tiny slice of that audience, then that already makes the numbers work out. So the decision, I think a lot of games like they try to stand on their own 2 feet and they don't say we're an X like. But in this case, it made sense to me because I was like, well, it doesn't seem like it because I think narrative games are quite it's like social media and Steam don't really know how to send narrative games to narrative players. There's some
Mm.
mismatch there, unfortunately. But I know that they're there, so if I can just find them, then they will be interested in the game and will hopefully buy it. And so I thought that by calling it a sleeper like and by sort of stressing the fact that it was Citizen Sleeper plus Dishonored, that's two franchises where if one of them resonates, then you're interested, and if they both resonate, you're like, oh, fantastic, it's my jam or whatever. And I think it's already kind of worked. It's currently recouped about 40% of the total cost of production. So I think it will probably recoup its total value in a year or two, which is not where I was hoping for, but I think it's sort of respectable for a narrative game.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it would have been more successful with the backing of a publisher because I think if they had an existing audience and they had the marketing resources, then I think they could have really broken through to that group of players who've played Citizen Sleeper and loved it. Uh, I still think there's tons of people who haven't heard about it who would love it, but it's difficult to reach them. So
Right.
and then to your second question about the what worked and what didn't when I sort of translated it over. Yeah, so I knew that I think the dice mechanic in Citizen Sleeper is really interesting, where you roll the dice at the start of the day, then you spend them. But I really wanted to hone in on this idea of precarity and vulnerability, and of always feeling like you're pushing your luck. And then that feeling of kind of getting over a hump where you thought it was very difficult, and then it turned out that if you just pushed hard enough, then you kind of get to the other side, and then everything sort of worked again. And so rather than using the roll all the dice ahead of time system, I just replaced it for a standard. You roll 2d6 and you add your skill against a difficulty, which is like it's a very old-fashioned system. Like I literally borrowed it from game books from the 1980s. So it's kind of the oldest and kind of clunkiest skill check in existence. But I particularly wanted that because when I played some of those game books, a 2d6 has a bell-shaped distribution, whereas if you roll one
Okay.
die, it's totally flat. And that meant that when you start the game, you're kind of you're on the bad side of the bell curve, so you have to roll quite high to get anywhere. And then I noticed as I put just like 1 or 2 points into a skill, I would climb the bell curve, and then suddenly, kind of overnight, with just 1 or 2 points, I would go from this skill difficulty being just like really hard to this skill difficulty being actually like pretty like not trivial, but it's like, oh, okay, I can actually do that. That's fine. And so I liked the way that that bell curve gave me this feeling of like this skill check is hard and difficult and crunchy. Switching over to, oh, actually, no, I can do this. It's like I'm going downhill now. So that was one sort of change. Another was that Citizen Sleeper has just energy and condition. And I knew that I could replace condition with stress, which is kind of borrowed from Blades in the Dark. Because I knew that, okay, you're a soldier. It makes sense that you have PTSD from the war, and I can make that stress go up every night because you have nightmares. So that seemed like a natural kind of parallel. Um, and I knew that I should still have something like energy because I knew that short-term goal of always feeding yourself worked really well. But I eventually realized that it's a game about like dealing with people in violent gangs and fighting against like fascist soldiers and stuff. So I knew that I needed a health stat, and then I knew, well, it makes sense that rather than having when energy is at zero and you lose more, rather than that increasing stress, that can just take off from your health, and that felt very natural. So, and then another kind of big change was that I decided to add a day-night cycle as well. So
Right.
you have 4 actions every day, and then when you're done with those, it flips over and you have 4 night actions. And I added that basically because when I play games like Skyrim, for example, I always like to install like a realism mod where you have to eat and sleep regularly because I felt that really helped with the immersion. And I thought, okay, if the thing that made me love Citizen Sleeper was that kind of daily grind of having to keep yourself fed, why can't I lean into that a bit more? And then it effectively doubles the amount of actions that you have access to in the game generally, because every location has day actions and night actions. So that means that you can work in the factory during the day and make money, but then at night you can steal from the factory and it feels different. So I thought that was kind of a nice addition that also made it feel like you were actually kind of living in the world.
Nice.
And then the other kind of sort of one of the other major changes I think is that whereas Citizen Sleeper has a fairly limited number of like inventory objects, but I thought I wanted more because I was used to that from Fallen London, and it also felt that like this sort of weird steampunk world should have lots of things to interact with and lots of items to acquire and items that could be turned into other items if you know the right people. Because I wanted like figuring out how to turn what you have now into a better future for yourself is kind of a core mechanic of the game. So if you've got like some scrap metal, it's like, okay, scrap metal, whatever. But if you can turn that into a device, which is a much more refined version of that, and then you can sell that device or you can use it somewhere, then like that sort of that sort of piecing together was quite integral to my vision, because I always liked the idea that like you're in a city where the city provides you with everything you need to survive if you can
Mhm.
only figure out how it all fits together. The only problem is the people ruling the city would prefer that you die. But the city itself gives you everything if you can just sort of make the right sort of connections. Yeah.
Right. Okay, awesome. Thank you for answering that. And something that I wanted to just come back to really quickly, since you
Mhm.
kind of brought it up multiple times, was this idea of immersion and creating that, and so much of the changes that you made having to fit your idea of immersion within the city of Dredgeport, the name of the city that's in Duskpunk. And I was curious, what for a game makes it immersive for you? Because as you were talking about even Skyrim there a second
Mm.
ago, you were talking about how you add a realism mod because you think that being aware of things like hunger and thirst add an extra level of immersion to it. Is immersion always a thing of survival for you? Because even with Dustpunk, like my immersion for the game definitely came from realizing, oh, I'm really paying attention to how much I need to eat each day. My stress is getting really high. I need to be aware. Is immersion, I guess the question I'm asking, a matter of survival and how to make people feel that tension with it? Is there other ways of immersion that you've seen in games, whether you for your own games or future ones you have minds or just ones you've played, that you think really capture that? What does
Mm.
immersion look like for you when you're looking at games as projects?
That is such a good question because it is the worst word in the world. Like it's got so many definitions, and everyone knows what it means, but nobody really knows what it means. Yeah. Um, I think for me, there's if immersion means I feel like I am immersed in the sense of like I feel like I am inside of the world of the game. And I think that there's multiple ways, or I guess multiple techniques you can use to kind of conjure up that immersion. And the most common ways are the images or the sounds of the game can really take you there. So one thing that I was very keen on was making sure that I had good sound design, so the
Mm,
sounds of the city are very present. And that's also why I have so many like illustrated images, because I want to kind of to take you to these actual like factories and docks and graveyards and stuff. But I think that a form of immersion that has been sort of neglected is it is related to that question of survival, but it's not quite that. It's that, well, if I exist in this world, one, the world should exist regardless of what I do, right?
mm,
The world should be this place that I can go to, but it doesn't require me in order to exist. Because if you go somewhere in real life, you know that this place existed before you witnessed it. You know it will continue to exist. It's that sort of permanence that makes it feel like it's an actual location. And I think there's a lot of games. Some games do this better or worse. I think a game like, I don't know, Caves of Cud or something is just
mm,
it's a roguelike set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. It's like the game is is just so invested in simulating that world, that it really doesn't care what you do in it. You're welcome to interact with it, but it's very clearly saying this world exists for its own sake, and you can come here, but you're not special.
yeah.
And I think that actually telling the player you're not that special is a way of saying this is not a buffet. This is not like a playground or a sandbox. This is a world with characters who care about stuff. And I think that that helps the player to kind of respect the world a bit more. A counterexample is if you play Assassin's Creed Origins, which is the Egyptian one.
Hmm.
It's an amazing world. In some ways, it's very immersive. The sounds and the characters are very immersive. But if you swim in the river and you swim for more than about 10 seconds, a boat is guaranteed to hove into view in front of you because
Mm.
the game developers know that you need a boat. And so a boat has appeared. And that feels just, it's a silly game, but it's that kind
Yeah.
of technique that I feel undermines it. And the other sort of flip side of that is immersion is you should be able to do the kinds of actions that a person in that role is able to do. Um, so like one thing I love about The Witcher 3 is that you can do lots of actions that a Witcher would do. So you can fight and you can, do spells and brew potions, and you can also get jobs from notice boards and you can haggle about the price of jobs. And I love the fact that they put those little things in there because yes, you're a small business owner basically. It's of course you're selling your labor and you're negotiating about that. What I don't like so much about The Witcher 3 is that you can't like there isn't any reason to do the things that a normal person would do in that world. So there's really no
Mm.
reason to eat or to drink, aside from combat buffs, um, or even to sleep. So it always feels a bit. It just feels a bit strange to me sometimes when you have these open worlds that are so committed to immersing you in so many ways, and then the character goes 100 hours without sleep, or without eating. It's just like I know that those are not the things that the players who play those games are interested in, but it just feels a bit off to me. And I think that there's a lot you can gain if you sort of lean into it a bit more. Oh, and a sort of similar to that is it's kind of related to both of those actually, is side quests or main quest givers who just wait around for you to turn up, and
Hmm.
only then does the quest continue. It feels really weird that like you're there are all of these things going on in an open world RPG, and there's all these people who want you to help them, and then you can leave them hanging for 100 days, and it has no effect on the quest at all, except in a minority of cases. So one thing that I also borrowed from Citizen Sleeper is the idea that like there's a kind of a progress bar called a clock,
Hmm.
which ticks up every time you sleep. And that means that the main quest is always moving forward because I wanted to have that feeling of like, yeah, if this world is independent of you, then it should keep going, even if you're not ready to click next on the main quest or whatever. So,
Yeah, no, I feel like that's something that I've been appreciating more myself too. One of the games that came out last year that was quite good and high on my list of just like games I really enjoyed last year was the game Keep Driving. It did
mhm.
several of the things that you talked about. Main one you just talked about with time going down and moving forward without considering your own input. Huge part of the game. Like you have to be very aware of, I need to get to X location on this map at this day or else the music festival is going to happen without me. Like that time is a very consistent part. And even when you pick up the hitchhikers in the game, they also have their own quests that they give you where they're like, hey, can you help me out with this? But those have
Mm.
their own timers as well. So like if I miss getting the was it a guitarist to his concert or band practice? I forget what the game specifically calls it. He just doesn't get there. Like now I've just left him in the dirt. So time is a very aware part of the game. In addition to having little things in it too, like gas is a consideration, money is a consideration, getting tired and driving worse as a result is a consideration. Little small decisions like that just really make the game feel more alive in the process. And I feel like that hits a lot of what you were talking about with immersion in general. Just the world
Yeah,
feels like
exactly.
it makes me follow its rules but in the same time could it continue to go on without me? I'm not the main character. I'm just a character in it. So then it's a really good way to
Mhm.
put it. It's a really good way to put it.
And I
Uh,
think that's also how the best like tabletop games go. Because if you the best tabletop game should be run by a game master who's like, you can faff around doing this, but there's always a consequence. There's always something happening in the background. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I know we've been going for a long time, and I appreciate all the time you've shared with me today. Just a few wrap up questions I wanted to get to was
Mhm.
the idea of likes. Like you said, you called yourself a Citizen Sleeper, like with your marketing. We see things like roguelikes. Like a big part of marketing in general is just likes. What is it about a game do you think that like part is referring to? As in, when someone makes a like, is it talking about the mechanics? Is it talking about the themes? Kind of where do you believe the limit of that as even a term is for both people that are
Hmm.
making the games when they're inspired and for people that are coming to these games?
So I think that for the most part, if you use like as a suffix, you're talking about mechanical similarity. Because if you're just talking about themes, then like then a cyberpunk adventure game would be a cyberpunk 2077 like, and I think
Mm,
that would be inaccurate because although they might have some similarities, people tend to play games based on genre or subgenre, and less based on the topics or the themes. I learned that when I made Silicon Dreams because I thought my cyberpunk audience from Spinaltality would come over from that. And they didn't because I had just made a narrative game and they had played a management sim. So,
oh,
um,
okay.
but I, so that was a really silly marketing decision from my point of view. Um, but I do think that sometimes it will be not just a mechanical overlap, but it will also be a thematic overlap. And I think that is true of Duskpunk because it would have been really weird to make a game inspired by Citizen Sleeper and have it be just to have no interest in like class struggle and the difficulties of the oppressed, because Citizen Sleeper is like it's less revolutionary, it's more about finding community on sort of a small scale, but it's still very interested in like why does it suck to do gig work and
Hmm.
how come companies can own bits of you, right? So it felt like it would have been. I was always going to end up there anyway, but it would have been really strange to make a Citizen Sleeper like that didn't embrace that aspect as well.
No, that makes sense. And that's something that I was also curious about because, like you said, I agree that most of the time when people say likes, they are talking about mechanics. Like even looking at roguelike on any Steam or any other gaming storefront, you will see so many games that are different from each other in narrative and themes that the only connective tissue is a term that some people not even sure would even agree what roguelike specifically means. And
Mhm.
so it's weird with something with Citizen Sleeper because I guess there is a world where you can make a dice driven RPG that does not talk about the things Citizen Sleeper did, but it does feel weird because Citizen Sleeper kind of having
Mhm.
what I would say a growing cultural importance to the space that it does, to make a game so similar to it and not negotiate with any of its content really
Mhm.
would come off strange. Is there any other games like that for you that like took inspiration from somewhere else, but then you're like, huh, it's really weird that it didn't even engage with this part of it as well?
Well, I mean, I was looking up what's it called? There was a game called no, it's got I know that I downloaded it recently, so I can go to my downloads
Yeah,
folder.
no problem.
To be smart about this. Stacklands, I think.
Stacklands, okay.
I think so. So Stacklands is um, it's a deck builder basically, where you have cards, and a card can represent a villager or a stick or a stone or a hut or a deer, and you put one card on top of another card, and that makes them interact. So if you use the villager on the stick, I think it generates like a tool or something, and then you
Okay.
can use the tool on the deer, and that generates food. So it's kind of like a sort of sandboxy, sort of clicking different things together to sort of make them connect, sort of thing. And the cards are just kind of the way that you do that. And I did find a game that billed itself as a Stacklands like, um, but it was also, I think the theme that it was engaging with was vampires. And what was really odd for me, actually, was actually that they were overly similar, because
Oh,
it was a game about vampires. So there were zombies and skeletons and ghouls and stuff, but there were still rabbits and tools and deer and villagers. And I'm like, that feels like a really odd borrowing, actually, because it's like you kind of expect when you take the genre of Stacklands and you make a Stacklands like, I think the understanding is that you are going to make some changes to the content, even if the form is the same.
mm-hmm.
So that one did really kind of seem quite odd to me, because it's like it's vampires. It's zombies and skeletons and ghouls and blood and castle. Like it's not that hard. The tropes are all there. So that seemed really odd to me. Um, but yeah, I think as a sort of a corollary to the what you said before as well, I think that I'm curious as to like why it is that the games that are like if you made a Witcher like, it would have to be a fantasy game, right? It couldn't be a
Yeah.
sci-fi game. When people made Doom clones, which were the first-person shooters back in the 90s, I think they had lots of different settings, but they all had the same kind of tone, which is that kind of hyper-violent, kind of gory style. So I almost feel like I'm curious as to to what extent these are developers who are mimicking the tone or the content of the original game because they are creatively interested in those features, and to what
Mm.
extent are they doing it because they know there's an audience and they need to align closely enough to the audience expectations to for the game to sell well, but not too close, because then it would just be like a
A
clone or something.
copycat at that
So
point.
I think that like exactly, yes.
You're absolutely Right about that. That's an interesting example. I hadn't even, when I asked that question, when thinking about something being overly familiar, but that's a good point. When it almost feels like a carbon copy with just a few changes, that almost end up hurting the copy at that point, since people will be making
Mm,
that association the entire time they play a game. Even with like playing Duskpunk, you only get a few hours into Duskpunk before it becomes clear that it's its own thing in its own world. But because my introduction to it was Citizen Sleeper, my brain's automatically making those comparisons first before I'm like, okay, no, here's the way that this is clearly its own thing as well. So it is an interesting to think about where exactly that term for like starts to create issues for the people that are borrowing it in the same way of like
mm,
not just in developing, but in how it gets shown to the world. Um, well, I mean, that
mm.
brings us basically to time. I mean, thank you for talking to me about this, James. It's been wonderful to hear your thoughts about making what might be the first Citizen Sleeper like. I know even Gareth has been like, I'm not sure if anything else has been exactly built as a Citizen Sleeper like before. But great game. If you haven't played it yourself, I suggest going and checking out Dustpunk. And where can people find you if they want to continue following your work?
Yeah, so the best place is my website, which is clockworkbird.net. It's all one word. And if you really want to learn about what I'm doing and make sure that you don't miss any of my work, the best way to do that is to sign up to my newsletter. And I don't spam you with like monthly updates or anything. I only talk about projects that I'm working on that I really want people to know about, and like when I start working on them, and then when they launch, and then sort of a few updates here and there. But I try to reduce email fatigue as much as possible. And I'm also on Blue Sky. Again, as I think on Blue Sky, I'm James Patton actually. I should know this. Yes, on Blue Sky. I'm James Patton. It's because you never look at your own handle; you just look at everybody
Yeah,
else's, right? You
absolutely.
know. And another place where people might like to interact is I also have a Clockwork Bird Discord. You can find that on the website at clockworkbird.net. It's very chill. It's very laid back. It's not like hugely active, but we have some interesting discussions and political discussions as well now and then. And I think it's a really nice sort of community to hang out in. So
Sweet. Awesome. Well, thank you again for making the time to talk today, James. And yeah, we'll
thank you
stop
for
there.
having me.
Yeah, no problem.